This is Justin Heap. He's a Republican legislator in Arizona. And he's come up with an idea so fundamentally stupid, it's a miracle he wasn't laughed out of the legislature for suggesting it. Far from it, the Republicans that control the legislature actually passed it. So what's Heap's big dumb idea that could bankrupt the state of Arizona? He wants Arizona to run its own census. You know, the big expensive thing the federal government does every 10 years? He wants to run the same thing, only in Arizona. You may be wondering what the motivation behind duplicating the effort of a federal agency that already does a pretty good job is. Let's let Justin explain it in his own words.
Rather than remain tethered to the federal system, which is going to affect all of our own districts and how our voting works in our state, that we set aside funds each year and allow our state to conduct its own census for use by the Redistricting Commission, where we can set the terms, and the baseline needs to be that we count voters. We count citizens of the U.S. as we apportion out our districts.
He wants a separate count apart from the federal system. He also said he wants to count voters and citizens, which are very separate things, but I'm going to ignore that for a moment and instead focus on this idea of a separate census. Heap is unhappy that the census counts undocumented migrants as part of the census. He wants to separate them out.
As in Arizona, we have in 2000, we passed our Independent Redistricting Commission, which relies on the federal census data that is taken by the federal census every 10 years and uses that data to redraw our district lines within our own state. So the makeup of this body is dependent on the federal census data, which counts residents and as population, not voters.
So the goal here is to exclude undocumented migrants so that areas with higher populations of undocumented migrants will have less representation in the legislature. Yes, it's election shenanigans. Justin Heap has made the brilliant connection that a lot of undocumented migrants live in cities and cities vote Democratic. Building on this connection, he has realized that if he can somehow lessen representation of those urban areas that vote Democratic, Republicans will be more likely to win elections. I'd suggest having more popular policies, but what do I know?
This will help us to better represent our districts and not make sure that we have certain areas, for example, densely packed urban centers that have disproportionate amounts of voting power in blocks, but less voters than other districts have in them.
No, he's not a very good speaker, but he got the point across. Democratic cities bad, Republican rural areas good. To reiterate, Republicans want to run their own census tailored to overcount Republican areas so they can award themselves more representation. Like senators in the Electoral College, this is just a participation award for democracy. So let's start looking at all the flaws this idiot plan has in it, starting with the most obvious, voters and citizens.
The baseline needs to be that we count voters. We count citizens of the U.S. as we apportion out our districts.
Heap keeps using voters and citizens interchangeably. Those two things aren't the same. If you wish to understand the difference, just walk into a prison and take a quick survey of who's a citizen, but not a voter. Also, are children not going to be counted in your census, Representative Heap? Because none of them are voters, but almost all of them are citizens. Do they deserve to be counted, even if they aren't voters? And finally, if you're only going to count voters, why don't you just use election results? Elections are literally counts of voters. There's a governor's election in 2030 when this proposed census will take place. Why not use that? It'd save a heck of a lot of money. Speaking of money, I bet you are wondering how much this boondoggle will cost. It's $5 million. Don't worry, someone asked Justin about how he got there.
How did you come to the $5 million?
I'm taking it. I spoke with the staff. They said Mr. Kavanaugh had come initially. Initially, my original proposal didn't contain an amount. I'm open to a discussion on it. I think $5 million is a reasonable estimation. Right now, we're not 100% certain how much it will cost, but we know that I think we can have the funds to do it. It takes the United States Census Bureau, spends about $10 billion to count the entire country in one go. Arizona is much more localized. It's much smaller. We can do it much more efficiently and much more cheaper than the federal government can do it.
Yes, he's doing the meme from Arrested Development. I mean, it's one census, Michael. What could it cost? $5 million? Also, I'm not shocked the original proposal didn't contain a budget. There probably wasn't room on the back of the napkin he wrote it on. To put this into perspective, the 2020 census was run for about $13.7 billion, which averages out to $41 per person. Representative Heap is proposing to run his census for less than $1 per person in Arizona. You, much like the gentleman who asked about how Heap arrived at $5 million, are probably now wondering how he plans to achieve such amazing cost reductions.
I'm wondering how you see the 5 million as reasonable.
I think we can do it way more efficiently than the federal government can do it. Arizona, again, is much more compact. Almost 70% of the state lives within Maricopa County or thereabouts in the district. We don't have that. We don't have all the vast things that the federal government needs to. And federal government has a lot more waste than state waste. I think we can do it for much cheaper.
I, for one, am not going to question Heap when it comes to his claim of being able to achieve a cost reduction of 97%. He seems to have a good head on his shoulders when it comes to finances. After all, he won't even let lobbyists make an appointment with him until the check clears. That sounds like good money management skills to me. But I am going to question how it's going to be conducted on such a budget. If you were going to premise this whole census on excluding certain people, I'm going to have to ask, how are you going to exclude them? Is there going to be a penalty for lying on the form? Who's going to enforce that penalty? This doesn't come up in his explanation on the bill. Also, it's not the biggest thing, but since he mentions density as a reason why he can achieve such cost savings, Arizona is not more dense than America, it's less dense. But let's put all these problems aside. Let's ignore that he doesn't know who he's counting, how much it will cost, or any of the mechanisms for doing it. Let's talk about the worst case scenario, the apocalypse promised in the thumbnail and in the intro. How is this bill going to bankrupt Arizona? The US Census isn't just a count of people for its own sake. It's done for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons is to determine the amount of money the state of Arizona is going to get from the federal government. Now, Heap's census plan isn't trying to replace the federal one for Arizona. He makes that clear.
We cannot get rid of the Census Bureau in terms of federal apportionment. That is in the Constitution. The federal government is still going to continue to run their own census, and they will use that for their federal apportionment. That's a federal issue. This bill can't touch that. This is for our drawing of our own districts within the state.
But that may not matter. The effects of running a second census on top of the US Census could be dire. It's hard enough to get people to fill out census forms once every 10 years. Now he's asking them to fill out 2 in 1 year? And adding in the addendum that only certain people get to fill out his census, most likely under some sort of criminal penalty? That's a recipe to severely depress returns for both censuses. And if that happens, the money that Arizona receives from the federal government could plummet. According to the Arizona Center for Economic Progress, Arizona received $28.7 billion from the feds, around 44% of all state revenues. Now imagine having to make up a few billion of that because Heap wanted to rig elections so Republicans could stay in control of the state legislature. Oh, but that's not the only problem with suppressing the turnout in a census. There's one more consequence.
The last time we conducted the census, for reasons unknown, Arizona was undercounted, which means we were expected to pick up a seat that we did not.
Yes, representation in Congress is determined by the census. If Heap's plan goes through and it decreases the return rate on the census, do you think Arizona is going to get that House seat that Heap was just whining about? Because I certainly don't think so. Now here's the good news. This Arizona-only census will probably never happen. The governor is going to veto it, and the only other way Republicans can put it into law is through a ballot initiative. And that's probably not happening either. And even if it does pass, this law is only a suggestion, not a commandment. It specifically says if the Arizona-only census doesn't happen, just use the federal one. So this whole thing is just a stupid waste of everybody's time and money. It feels more like a mission statement than an actual plan or a bill. And you are all welcome to make an appointment to tell Representative Heap that this is stupid, but keep in mind, when making an appointment with Representative Heap, donations are not required, but they are appreciated. I'm History Sock, and I'll see you at the next committee meeting.